Welcome back. And it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote interview subject, David Bohrman. David is one of the most innovative, experienced, and respected TV journalists and executive leaders for more than 30 years, from producer to executive producer to senior management at ABC News, NBC News, CNN-FN, CNN, Pseudo, and Current TV. As CNN's Washington bureau chief, he was named one of Washington's 50 most influential and powerful journalists by Washingtonian magazine and one of Fast Company magazine's 100 most creative people in the world. His TV career started in local news as a producer at the CBS station in Los Angeles. He was part of the original staff on Nightline at ABC News, and he has created dozens of programs across ABC, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, and other media outlets. Among his many accomplishments, he was responsible for CNN's YouTube presidential debates, as well as CNN's Magic Wall, which revolutionized broadcast storytelling, most notably by John King during the CNN election coverage. He has been executive producer of dozens of elections, primary and convention nights, including in 2002, 04, 06, 08, and 2010 for CNN. Bohrman was brought back to NBC News and MSNBC in 2016 to lead a redesign for those networks' election coverage, including executive producing the NBC network election night program. He also helped lead the 2018 MSNBC midterm coverage. In 2019, he took on as a client CBS News to assist the president of CBS News Division with the 2020 presidential election event live coverage. And this included debates, primaries, political conventions, and election night. He also worked to transform broadcast data visualization technologies such as in the CBS Evening News Studio, augmented reality, multi-touch screen, and a custom-designed election center studio for November 2010. For the November 3rd election night, he was executive producer for CBS News Live election coverage. He's the winner of 6 Emmy Awards, 18 Emmy nominations, and 2 Peabody Awards, among other distinctions. And he currently leads the Bohrman Group, where he assists both traditional media companies and networks, as well as new media companies in innovation, programming, and organizational transformation. Welcome, David.
Gee, well, you've used up all of our time with the intro, so I guess we're done.
And now that we're done with that, so David, I just spent almost an hour talking with 3 news VPs about the trust issue and how they are reconciling that with viewers. When we were talking in preparation for this interview, you were especially emphatic about the false equivalency problem in TV news. How bad is that problem?
Well, I think it's bad across media. I think there's almost pervasive equivalency. And part of it is on social media, part of it is on broadcast media. And here's an example of the false equivalency problem. You might be able to find a smart person to argue that climate change is bogus. You certainly can find a smart person to argue climate change is real. But the reality is you can find 9 million people that will tell you climate change is real. You might only find 1,000 that think it's bogus. But you put one up against one, and all of a sudden, the level has been set, and the playing field looks like it's equivalent. And it's a false equivalency for some issues like climate change. I did a quick web search this morning just to prove it out. I went onto Twitter and I looked at Flat Earth. Right? There are hundreds and hundreds of groups of Flat Earth societies that you can find on Twitter. And what social media has done is it's a great gift to us, but it's a curse because it makes a flat playing field and equivalency for any topic that you can think of. And one of the problems is that I noticed today that President Trump was tweeting all day long today, despite the fact that the Electoral College met yesterday, and even Speaker McConnell came around to congratulate the president-elect. President Trump's been tweeting all day about how the election was stolen, and Twitter has this. It's a big step. It says this hasn't been proven, but it's a very weak-kneed response to the fact that the message is out there, and somehow we need to use the expertise that we all have and have had for years, back when there were 3 networks and a few major newspapers, where there was a gatekeeper function. And one of the things that made our skill set valuable was that we had some judgment and some background and could put knowledge into context. And that has kind of evaporated when you look across the social and even the broadcast media landscape in many instances. So I think that the false equivalency or out of whack equivalency is an issue that we all need to keep in mind as we talk about difficult, controversial stories where we know there are people who believe different things. You don't want to squelch dissent and difference of opinion, but you also don't want to artificially boost things that are absurd, like the earth being flat.
Well, so social media platforms put disinformation labels or otherwise flag material that's factually wrong now. So should cable networks be required to label shows that are opinion based, or should cable operators be required by law?
Maybe. I remember a few years. Well, by law is a complicated addition to your phrase. I remember several years ago when Stephen Colbert had his truthiness index. And I think a truthiness index somewhere across media would be intriguing to do. I'm interested in learning more about it's the woman from Tegna who was on, talked about the Verify, to be able to, because I've visualized 10 years ago a meter, a red-green meter strength on validity of anything that's been posted based upon a history of posting and other factors. And I think that there is some merit to that. I think that by and large, cable news viewers have a pretty good sense of where the networks are that they are watching. I don't think that by law, cable news networks should be required to do anything the way you suggest. However, I do think that the social media players almost need to begin to play by the rules that the major broadcasters play by. You know, they've been given this exemption on they're a common carrier, so they're not responsible at all for the content of what's on it. And I think that and I know there's some provocative, smart thinkers like Kara Swisher and others out there who really have come around to the fact that the world is now different. These people need, the people who are responsible for these are media platforms. And I think there needs to be some sense of responsibility for what's on there. I think you'll get more careful curation. You'll get stronger warnings. You may not want to block anything, but I think the warnings that we're seeing now, although they're a good first step, are awfully feeble in their early stage right now.
So you executive produced CBS News's election night coverage, as I said in my introduction. Obviously, the stakes were huge for TV news in this election. Organizations spent ample time readying resources for it, and any number of unprecedented contingencies that might have come up. Tell us briefly about your own preparations, because as I understand it, you weren't just preparing for a single night as well, just like the other organizations, but for multiple nights or even weeks.
Right. We were preparing for an open-ended election that could have gone as long as, well, yesterday, or maybe till January 6th when Congress actually ratifies. I would have been shocked had election night ended on November 3rd. I mean, of all the election nights I've produced, the only one that wasn't decided by the time I got up was in 2004. I sat in the chair at CNN, and by about 8 a.m. I got up, and that was the John Kerry lost to George Bush in the 2004 election. But all the other nights we did learn at some point during the night. But I would have been shocked had we known on the 3rd, because we understood the dynamics of voting and what the pandemic was going to do. And in fact, there were states like Pennsylvania that were precluded from touching or opening these ballots prior to the closing of polls. And there's a process involved in opening and matching and validating ballots and processing ballots. The decision desk at CBS News, which is very similar to the decision desk at NBC News and CNN. I've been parts of those groups. I know how we and they approached the night, and it would have been extraordinarily unlikely for us to learn to know the answer that night. Look, it was unbelievably complicated to produce election night in any event, in a COVID environment, in a new studio. it was factor of 100 more complicated. Everybody involved had daily COVID tests for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks as a new studio was being stood up, as the control room was being cleaned between every shift, and as we brought the resources and technologies on board for the augmented reality, for the data walls, the video walls, the touchscreen technology. Everything was complicated by fewer people, distances, and constant COVID testing. We also knew editorially that it was going to be an immense challenge. We even built, I don't know if you have a screen. I sent you a screen.
Yeah, I think we have a grab to look at from CBS.
So okay, this is a screen that nobody actually saw. If you're watching CBSN, you might have seen a version of it. But this was a screen I only had designed for the Anthony Salvato Decision Desk team as we got into day 2 or day 3 or day 4. And basically, there was a series of troughs at the bottom. And if a state was called, it would have a check mark and it would drift left or right. But there were CBS News. We made a conscious decision to tell what we knew about every state when the poll closed, and we characterized them as leaning or likely or toss-up. And these tiles were dynamic, and the green line at the bottom represented how much of the vote had been counted in that state. Any of those tiles could be touched. And if you go back to it, Delaware had just been touched on this sample, and it shows that, well, 100% of that vote was in that state. So we could track the progress of vote in any state. And in theory, days 2, 3, 4, in the toss-up zone, you would have had Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then we could have moved them around to see what the impact would have been on the overall electoral vote. This was, again, a screen that was very complicated to do, was not intended to be used on election night, but was intended to be used if we got into a multiple day linger and to see where we are in the state, in the counting of the state and the processing of the vote and our knowledge of the status of the state. Ultimately, this was how it ended up. But it was really meant for beyond election night. And those were just one example of the thinking that we put into how we deal with an election night that is an election week or 2 weeks or longer.
Right. There's been some criticism that the networks could have done a better job explaining early in the election reporting that in-person voting results would soon be supplemented by mail-in ballots. How well do you think the networks did at explaining and do generally explaining to the public the nature of the vote count and the reason behind the way that the votes were counted over such a long time?
Well, I must admit to have been pretty siloed. I mean, I was in a control room wearing an N95 mask and a headset for 9 hours or 8 hours on election night. So I didn't hear what the other networks and the other news divisions were doing. I do think that I know that we spent an awful lot of time in our live election programming and in the lead up to actually explain just that and why and how the vote was going to happen. We had another series of displays with our touchscreen that would not just show red or blue if there was if Biden or Trump was ahead. There were 2 tracks to this. One showed a degree of lead, large, medium, and small. The other showed the CBS News estimate, which was regardless of where the actual day of voting was, but it was part of the modeling that had been built up by our decision team, who had talked to 100,000 voters in the time leading up to the election. And they were constantly building and refining their models. And we were quite clear about the magnitude of the problem to count votes and the length it would take to count votes. I'm not sure, again, how my colleagues did at the other networks. I think everybody tried very hard to explain that voting was going to take quite a while. I'm not sure all the viewers sort of got that. I'm not sure the White House and the administration really understood that votes that came in late weren't votes that were cast after the election. They were just votes that were piled up and couldn't be counted, for instance, or because of COVID had been mailed in and were part of this unbelievable number of votes, more votes than we've ever had in the nation's history. And it was a complicated process to do. So, I know what we did at CBS. I think that I think we did a really clear job of it, but I don't know what my other colleagues did.
So looking at the totality of the experience and presuming hopefully we don't have a pandemic impediments to deal with the next time around, how would you, where if at all would you pivot for the midterms or for the next presidential election in your tactical
we
approach?
certainly learned a lot about um, about the nature of voting and about the difficulty or ease. It's mostly difficulty for people to cast their votes, and I think that we may want to be, if we can be out in the world, which was another issue for making coverage of the campaign and the last month of the campaign difficult. I think that being able to evangelize the process of voting and discuss the process of voting in a better way, even, we CBS and other organizations ended up with a series of tools, I think, on our website, on how to vote wherever you are. You put in your zip code in your town, and you'll learn the details of where you can vote and how you can vote. But the number of polling places was severely reduced, largely because of COVID, but more necessary because of COVID. And I think that the one of the things you referred to in the last segment, the civics part, I think the civics part of this, I think, can be more of a major editorial focus than just the issues, which are always always critical to and part of coverage. Because one of the things I think that we've seen is that it's not purely issues that drive an election output. It's sort of a gut check, and it's a personality check on the candidates, as well as just a pure stand on the issues. And I think we need to be better at learning about it, talking about it, and describing it as we lead up to the next set of election nights. But the data visualization tools, the more we can use things like the touchscreen or big video walls or other ways to tell stories, the better the viewing audience will be served.
Let's talk about video walls. First, I think we have an image, an early video wall image to just put out there for just a second. We'll come back to what.
So this is,
go ahead.
This is a frame from what I've described as a trade show for spies. It was something called GeoInt. It's a conference hosted by the National Geospatial Institute, which hardly anybody knows exists. I barely knew it existed. It is the remote sensing. It's part of the government that deals with satellites. And so I signed up to go to a conference that had about 3,000 or 4,000 people, and they're all spies. They're all dressed in suits, but they're all talking about satellite technology and how to brief military. And in the Lockheed booth was this kid named Jeff Hahn, who had just graduated from NYU and had started up a company called Perceptive Pixel. And he was demonstrating this multi-touch wall. And it took me about 15 seconds of looking at it until I realized, oh my God, what an unbelievable storytelling tool this is. And I think this was in late 07 or mid to late 07, as I was beginning the planning for the 2008 coverage. I was the CNN bureau chief in Washington, and the election coverage and special events were my responsibility. I'm always looking for new displays and new ideas. I had started the Situation Room at CNN a year or so before then, and it was a no-brainer. And I was lucky enough to control a number of CNN budgets. And I went to my budget controller and I said, I want to buy it. I said, it's going to be an election expense. I won't go over budget, I promise. We bought it. We brought it in for what I thought was going to be a test for it in the DC Bureau. It was so obviously perfect that we immediately shipped it up to New York and started using it for the primaries and caucuses that began in late January, early February of 2008. And when I married it to John King, the light bulb, I think, went off in everybody's head when what I seem to recall, the Indiana primary was the sort of the breakthrough moment when everybody said, "Oh my God, I see what this tool can do." There was the other networks had called Indiana for Senator Clinton. CNN, we had not, and John King was able to use this new touchscreen, and only been on the air a couple of weeks, to explain why we were not yet ready to call Indiana. and in any previous election night, it would have been a confounding conversation, just chatting between people, maybe with a map. But I think you've got a clip of part of
Yeah.
the breakthrough here. Let's roll that, and you can see how it helped us tell that story.
Welcome back. We're still not able to project a winner in Indiana. It's very close right now, 52% to 48%. Hillary Clinton is still on top. But, and it's a huge but, there's one county in the northwestern part of the state where the results haven't come in yet. And that's a county where Barack Obama, John, is expected to do well.
He is expected to do well. All of the drama, Wolf, in Indiana, now being caused by Lake County. It's about 8% of the state's population and includes the cities of Gary and Hammond. It is just a short drive from Chicago, Barack Obama's home base. So the expectation is this is a place with a significant African-American population where Obama should do well. Why is it completely white on this map? Because local officials are saying there are 11,300 and an odd number, 11,307 absentee ballots that they are counting, and they say they will not release any results from the county until the absentee ballot count is completed. And to add to the drama, they say it could be midnight before they have this count and therefore then release the results. Now, why does that matter? Let's zoom back out to the statewide. Also, some votes still being counted down here in Marion County. Barack Obama winning 67% to 33%. Based on our model of turnout across the rest of the state, it is our estimate that Barack Obama would have to win about 57% of the vote in Lake County if the turnout is about where we expect it to be. So can he do it? Yes, he can mathematically. Will he do it? The map would suggest to you Senator Clinton has done well surrounding it. Probably not. But mathematically, it is possible, and we need to wait. And this county is different from these neighboring counties because of the African-American population in Gary. So you might say, oh, look, that area is for Clinton. This area is different demographically. It does favor Barack Obama. Very difficult math, but it is still possible, which is why we have not called this election.
So this is what news technology really is for, to help the viewers understand the story better. And I'll tell you, my friends at the other networks, especially the folks I just worked with at CBS, they remember that night and they were sweating it because this made a lot of sense, and they were nervous that they had already called it. But this explained, you know, we never used the word transparency back then, but this let us explain our process and explain why we hadn't called it and what all the factors were that were going into it. And it's a perfect example of how technology can help television news move forward and help inform viewers.
Well, you can have a great car, but you also need a great driver. And it seems like John King, he's doing something that other networks maybe ought to be studying and adapting. So what is it to you that makes his fluency with using this wall such a standout?
It's a combination of sort of deep knowledge and no fear, and the ability to, it sounds silly to say walk and chew gum, but just the understanding that it's a tool that you can use and you can control it. It's very simple to use. You touch it, something happens. It took me 20 minutes to go over all the basic operation with John. There's buttons for history, you hit a state, you can back up, simple navigation. But most people that try it it's a combination of tongue-tied and finger-tied, because there is a performance part to it, but the performance isn't an old-fashioned circus performance, but it's being able to use your latest tool. And if you're good on a computer, you can type really well. Okay, that's a skill. Being able to touch and interact with your computer is a skill. Steve Kornacki, who I was able to work with at MSNBC, is fantastic at this as well. There are people who have percolated to the top of the ability of understanding what lurks beneath the data and why the data is there and how to use the data to explain the story. So it's comfort, it's facility, and it's confidence that you can tell a story, and you don't worry about it breaking. You don't worry about what happens, and if something goes wrong, you just deal with it. And too many people are afraid of touching a new technology.
So what do you say to a tentative anchor who is, a lot of newsrooms have these video walls, and a lot of anchors are very tentative about using them. So what's the advice you give to them?
The advice is make sure that the software that you're using is straightforward and makes sense, and don't try to do something that you don't understand. You know, the folks, since a lot of your group are local station managers or employees, you know, the teams that are most used to dealing with things like this are your weather groups, but by and large, they deal with a chroma key and a couple of buttons. Some of them do use touch screens, but it is a hugely valuable tool for straightforward reporting. There's no reason that a newsroom shouldn't be able to tell the COVID story with a touch screen, where the infections are, where the hospitals are, where the vaccines are going to be located. You drill in on it. You get the stats. You can overlay census data. I mean, data journalism is becoming an integral part of where social, digital, and mainstream media need to go. And you've got to have tools that you can use to illustrate and exploit data. It's just, you need to make sure that you've got the data, you've got it a straightforward interface. It's a little mystifying to me why we have not seen a lot of great other work in it. And maybe, you know, maybe there's room for, you know, I think there's a business opportunity there to create a really good touch set of apps for newsrooms, so that they can get data that is national and locally important and easy to use, because it's complicated to make. I mean, it took dozens and dozens and dozens of design, function, data meetings to be able to churn out the new one at CBS. The one at CNN, the company, you know, Perceptive Pixel, had built this in a very obscure computer language called C++ because it was built for military briefings. But ultimately, this is now, I think, on the cusp of being something that's readily available to newsrooms.
So you brought up data journalism, data visualization. I mean, underpinning the video walls and reaching far more broadly are those areas. And some organizations are far better than others at adopting it so far. I know among other groups, ABC-owned stations has someone, he's going to be on a panel tomorrow with us, who's the head of a unit on data visualization. I'm wondering where and how you think data journalism should be playing a role in every newsroom, local and otherwise, going forward.
Well, there's almost no story that's not going to be helped by it. I mean, you got to be careful not to use technology for technology's sake, because then it becomes wasted, useless, and nobody listens to it. But again, let's go back to COVID. The COVID story is so deep, has so many tentacles, and there is so much data that's involved in needing to be told to the viewers. Move it to weather. Weather, clearly, it doesn't need to be done on a green screen. You could exploit weather, the storms that are coming in right now in the east, where to be, where not to be, as long as you've got. I mean, because the one great thing about election nights, and I did a South by Southwest conference a couple of years ago. They provide an opening for major broadcast networks to step forward in technology, and because the amount of data on election night, the huge volume pipeline of real-time data, requires you to have the tools to be able to exploit that data and tell those stories. Election nights and Olympics, I mean, I think we find every 4 years that there are television breakthroughs that we see in election years and in Olympic years that help move the whole industry forward. And I think that we can learn from what has worked and not worked, but we need to plunge forward and take advantage of being better equipped to tell the viewers what the story is, where it is, how we know it, and what they can do. Well,
so I mean, pragmatically speaking, especially at a local level, should every newsroom have a point person who's their data journalist expert? I mean, is this best tackled in a sort of centralized way for a station group or a national organization, or should you have somebody who owns visualizations on a daily basis at a given station?
I think phase one, someone should probably own it. It's mostly been I've been sort of lucky enough back to ABC News and at NBC and CNN and even the latest work at CBS. I've been the the renegade who has insisted on pushing into something new that nobody thought of before. And it only happened by force of my size and weight and loudness and the fact that I had a pretty responsible job and I delivered results. But I think in an interim, someone at each news organization, if someone can own it, they can help shield it from the forces that want to make it go away and help cultivate it and nourish it so that we can find people who can work on it. Ultimately, I think everybody should be able to take advantage of it and use it if they can. I mean, it's, again, you don't have every single journalist edit. You have a lot of journalists now who can. You don't need every journalist, every anchor to be able to do a multi-touch wall, but there's almost no reason that they can't, as long as you've set up an environment that makes it be straightforward and helps the viewer.
So augmented reality, another technology I want to touch on. That's another emerging technology where you played a key role at CNN, where use in news broadcasting was pioneered. It's starting to broaden out elsewhere, and certainly the playbook for using it is getting more and more refined. First of all, what's the case for anyone to use AR in news?
Well, it's a way to help explain a story to the viewers. I think let's take elections off the table for a moment. I think the Weather Channel and some of the weather examples we've seen for augmented reality are spectacular, as you can visualize in a studio the dynamics of a storm or a hurricane or a cyclone and what is happening in three-dimensional space. The election augmented, we have all been dabbling at parts of it. In 2008 at CNN, we had an augmented Senate that was on a table, and John King could talk about the race. Senate was it's still complicated to really explain. In 2008, we also did what both got praise and ridicule, which was the hologram with Jessica Yellen in Chicago being beamed into Wolf-Blitzer, and Will.i.am was beamed in to the CNN headquarters in New York. He chatted with Anderson Cooper. I think it's a toe in the water of where TV's going to go. You've noticed that Oprah's interview with Obama was done in a somewhat similar way, with green screen, bringing them together, two people looking like they're in the same room. So I think that augmented reality can help show you things that are hard to show you. This year at CBS, we did an augmented map of the US that showed the status of the states, which worked well. The thing that I think was most interesting there was we did an augmented Senate that was based on the physical layout of the seats in the Senate. And the Senate was 100 seats. There are all assigned seats. All the Republicans are on one side. All the Democrats are on the other. And I had been trapped in TV news think that if you have 53 Republicans, you're going to have 3 on the other side and 50 on one side. No, they actually move all the furniture around. And we were able to do a 3D model of the actual Senate, showing all the seats that were up. So many of them were in the red zone, and here they were. And we had Nancy Cordes with an iPad being able to control the Senate. It gave a very different view of the struggle for control of the Senate and the seats that were up. It just helps tell the story. And there may not have yet been the home run example for AR in TV news yet, but there have been some very successful toes in the water. And I think that the more of us that experiment with it and use it, the more creative we can be at helping to tell the stories. They're all fundamentally based on the same rendering technology that makes all of our real-time graphics happen anyways. So it's not a hugely extra heavy lift to do augmented. It just requires a little bit of thought.
So is it scalable? Can it work on a local level as well as it does in a national?
It can. I mean, there are basically two buckets of technology that are real-time renderers. Most of the augmented that the networks are using is rendered by VizRT. The others are being rendered in like Unreal engines. But it's basically just, if anyone who's familiar with how Viz works, all the VizRT graphics are a scene. They're fed by data. And the augmented reality scene is just a scene. And if a camera is tracked in three-dimensional space, so you know where it is in the room and you know what it's looking at, what the focal point is, moving up and down, the real-time renderers can draw the right image that it would be seeing. And the more tracking you have, the more cameras you can attach to it, and then you can cut around and you can see it as though it were in the room. You want to be careful not to fall into the world of sort of fakery and trick photography. You want to figure out how to make it be a storytelling tool, and I think that we can now open that door and tell some stories in a better way with the new technologies that are available to us.
So what are the biggest challenges or pitfalls to using it still?
Well, it's things break. I remember in 2010, we had a John King augmented reality feature that we did at CNN that I called the Election Matrix, where we saw all the congressional seats organized by when the incumbent took place. And that there was a big wave. There was a big sort of Tea Party wave, and it wiped out many Democratic seats that had been there for a while, and it was spectacular. But at one point, I had to give the one cue that I was fearful to do, which is pull the drape, because it involved a small area of a green wall to make it happen, and the Viz engine died, and it crashed, and we had to cover it up until we got it fixed. So these technologies are great, and they're additions, but everybody needs a backup. I had backup to everything that we did at CBS. I've had backup to everything that we've done at the other networks, because technology breaks, and you need to be able to fix it. But it's just part of helping to move forward. Videotape used to break. Live remotes fail. I mean, just television can be complicated, and the parts of television aren't 100% reliable 100% of the time.
I want to ask you about streaming. It's becoming an essential platform to find viewers or to hold on to them as they're cutting the cord. And most news organizations, including now even newspapers like the Washington Post, have some sort of presence there. So news, it seems, has a lot of opportunity to expand content there, offer video on demand opportunities that they've never had before. In your estimation, is news capitalizing on streaming as much as it should be right now?
Well, I think I'm very impressed at what the Washington Post and the New York Times are doing in streaming. I think that they've been bold and daring with ideas on streaming. The Times has gone into some VR streaming, which has been amazing. A woman who used to work for me at CNN helps oversee the post-video content. And it's not just putting up hearings, although they put up hearings. There's very novel, creative content that's being produced under the umbrella of the newspapers. To some extent, I think the newspapers are, if it was some kind of a race, although it's not, I think newspapers are making sort of more creative use of some of the streaming options than much of television. But I will tell you, I was sort of hugely impressed at CBS by the existence of the dozen or 24, I don't know where the number is right now, of CBSN channels that are streaming. And if you go on the CBS All Access app on my iPad, I realized that I can see one of 10 or 15 or 20 live streams from a CBSN program happening in cities all across the country. That's a novel way to sort of multicast the resources that the stations are doing across the country. I know there are always issues with affiliates and rights and use, but at the end of the day, to be able to provide the key resources and content and the product of journalists across the internet in novel ways is really is helpful and important. But I think that there's the broadcast networks have had in the last 20 or 30 years as streaming and digital work and has become a critical role. There's it's been rough going. It seems to me that I've always run into a divide between the .com part of the networks I've worked for and the actual live TV parts of the networks that I have been part of. And it should be easier, it should be smoother, it should be more synergistic. There's a word from 25 years ago, and it's always harder than it should be. And I think that maybe there wasn't the same baggage as the TV, as the newspapers began to step into interesting streaming creativity. And look, there are probably some local things I'm not even aware of that are going on that are creative and helpful to viewers as well. But at the heart of it, you gotta serve the viewers, and that's what I always try to keep my focus on.
Well, looking ahead to what a news organization, any again, local or national, starts putting on its streaming channels, do you think more personalization is what they should be going for, more bespoke content for streaming that's not simply carried over from what they're showing on their linear broadcast?
Well, there are some spectacular new technologies that allow amazing customization. So there can be a core program, and you can have a whole different set of lower thirds or banners or information graphics than I have, even though we're watching the same program. There are companies that are doing this today. I've been talking to them about some other projects that I've been working on. So I think that there's a blend of core content with personalized wrappers, if that makes much sense. And because we can get so many things from our phones and our tablets and our set-top boxes, the number of sort of bespoke or unique content categories are almost infinite. And I think we can service people with a lot of interests in styles, in formats that again give a core bit of content, but with a uniquely personalized sort of wrapper around it, whether again it's on a phone or a tablet or on an OTT device. So I think that there are some interesting challenges that can be solved and can be really gratifying.
I want to come back to the trust issue I've been talking about earlier today in the context of social media. The two major relevant platforms for news, Facebook and Twitter, they took a number of preemptive steps to avoid misinformation in the election. They've taken a lot of heat for the efficacy or the lack thereof of those steps. And meanwhile, TV news has developed a kind of symbiotic relationship with these platforms. So I wonder, to the extent that it can, where should the industry, if at all, be putting pressure on Facebook and Twitter to better manage misinformation going forward?
I think we talked about this briefly at the beginning. I think that we need to, I don't use the word paradigm very often. I think we need to change the paradigm for them. I just don't think they can or should be given a pass on responsibility for the content that's on the platforms. I think that we're not, whether we're broadcast or cable, we still, I think all of us believe we have some fundamental responsibility to be right, to be accurate, to make sure that we're not putting up falsehoods. And I think that it's a bigger challenge, but again, these companies are worth billions of dollars. I think that they need to take on the responsibility. And this is just me speaking because I'm not part of a news organization right now. But I think they need to take on some of the responsibilities that we all have when we're in leadership at cable or networks or broadcast, of somehow battling against disinformation and not just giving a blind eye to it and saying, well, it's not our problem, it just happens to be on our stream or on our feed or on our pages. And I think that, and that's gonna probably require some regulation. I remember when I was at my undergraduate years ago at Stanford, you had to study the Communications Act of 1934, which covered a lot of rules until cable really broke things apart. And the reasoning was because the airwaves needed to be used in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Now, they were limited, and that was one of the reasons that were given for limiting the airwaves and putting these rules into effect. But just the fact that you may have an unlimited number of websites or hashtags or URLs or bots or feeds I think that there may need to be, whether it's revoking this 230 clause in the communications group or whatever it is, I just think responsibility needs to be put on to those organizations because they're seen as news feeds by their customers, by their viewers. Because the part of the ugly reality is that the commodity of those companies are the customers, right? It's they're selling us, and whatever they put on there, if they don't have any responsibility for it, they may get more clicks, they may get more advertising revenue, and they're monetizing us. But I think they have a responsibility to for some of what goes on those sites, and that's actually, I think, probably an out there statement. I don't know if a lot of people that are there yet, but I think that that's where we're going, and I think that part of that is at the core of the action being taken against Facebook. I noticed that the Europeans today are having a similar conversation about all the tech companies in Europe, but I think that one of the problems is it's getting commingled with business monopoly, which is, I think, is a separate issue. So I think you need to decouple business monopoly issues with editorial responsibility issues. Right now, they're all jumbled together because most everyone in charge of anything in the country doesn't really understand the technology, so they get them all lumped together. It's almost unfortunate that there's not a major part of the Senate or the House or the government or even a cabinet office that is somehow given the responsibility of untangling this knot, because the realities of technology are way beyond where the elected officials are.
So we just have a few minutes left. I want to ask you about a couple more things. We've been talking about trust and technology, and I want to talk about the people in this industry who are the conduits for both. The roles of anchors and reporters are evolving fast, and people coming into those positions need all new skill sets and fluencies. What should we expect of anchors and reporters now? How are those expectations different than they were just even a few years ago?
Well, I think that the one of the main drivers for success and respectability is a heightened sense of criticalness, if that makes sense. But especially our anchors need to be ready to question more. And one of the things I've always hated is getting served up a bunch of talking points for a politician and not really battling them back. That's one of the reasons I really wanted to create the YouTube debates, because I knew it would put the candidates off their guard, and we weren't going to get talking points for questions that were coming in over YouTube. And I think that anchors and to a large extent reporters, the more they can with a basic set of facts and knowledge, push back on misinformation, disinformation immediately, the better it's going to be. And that's a lot of responsibility on the anchors, because they're doing 1,000 things. They're juggling what's on, they're juggling what's next. They're thinking about 100 things they're going to have to do. Plus they know they've got 40 seconds left, right? But being able to say, stop, explain this to me, because it doesn't make any sense. A degree of slow down and explain this, and I don't know what that's called, but I think that's you know it when you see it, and you see a fair number of people who are really good at it. But then you also know it when you find it missing, and you find something has gone by without being questioned or challenged that you yourself don't actually think might have been accurate. So it's editorial questioning and editorial pushback, I think, is what's needed almost more than anything else.
So in the last just really half a minute we have left, how does a TV news organization build real, continuous, ongoing innovation into its culture?
You don't discourage people from having crazy ideas. You accept that some of them will fail, and you need to try to strive to find people who won't do things the way they think they're supposed to, because you'll end up with the same old thing everywhere, every day. You want to find someone who's a little odd, who's a little off, and willing to take a chance on something new. They can take a bit of technology they see here and a bit of editorial need they see here and see a way to fuse it together. Whether it's creating innovation officers or innovation groups or bonuses for new ideas. But you want to foster the ability to challenge people to come up with crazy ideas, and maybe one of them will stick. Maybe there's a internal competition for a way to fuse technology and editorial need, and at the end of that competition, it actually happens. But I think you want to figure out how to cultivate people who are willing to take a chance and maybe not succeed at it, but it won't be without cost, but the rewards are significant because you can move the industry forward.
Excellent. A good note on which to end. We've come up against our time, so thank you so much, David, for your insights. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.